We have to make a clear distinction whether it was a Ukrainian group, whether it may have happened at Ukrainian orders, or a pro-Ukrainian group without knowledge of the government. But I am warning against jumping to conclusions. There are indications, not coming from me but rather expert opinions. I do not own up to them, but I want to point them out, that there also has been talk that it may have been a so-called false flag operation. This would not be a first in the history of such events. This is why I am very careful to avoid any premature conclusions.
Russia's war of aggression grinds on against Ukraine, and over the last weeks and months we have seen fierce fighting in and around Bakhmut, and what we see is that Russia is throwing in more troops, more forces, and what Russia lacks in quality they try to make up in quantity. They have suffered big losses, but at the same time we can not rule out that Bakhmut may eventually fall in the coming days. And therefore, it is also important to highlight that this does not necessarily reflect any turning point of the war, it just highlights that we should not underestimate Russia. We must continue to provide support to Ukraine. So what we do know is that there was an attack against the Nord Stream pipelines, an act of sabotage, but we have not been able to determine who was behind. There are ongoing national investigations, and I think it's right to wait until those are finalized before we say anything more about who was behind. It demonstrates the importance of protecting our critical undersea infrastructure, because we have thousands of kilometers of gas pipelines, of oil pipelines, of power grids, and also, of course, all the internet cables, and all of this infrastructure is critical for our societies. NATO has addressed this for many years, but after the attacks against the Nord Stream pipelines, we have stepped up. We have established a cell at the NATO headquarters to coordinate efforts among NATO allies, to share more information, to work with the private sector that often owns this infrastructure, and to do more to minimize the risk and increase the protection of critical undersea infrastructure.
Smile, thank you. Okay, let's go. Thank you.
Nej, just slått där. Näst längst ut till vänster.
Portugal.
Och han...
Thank you. Thank you.
The U.S. wants Germany to be subservient to its geopolitical objectives in Europe, and undermining the economic relationship between Germany and Russia helps in that, and it also increases the pressure on within the German government to support the NATO proxy war in Ukraine. If there was even a smidgen of belief that it was Russia that had blown it up, there would be an international investigation, and we would have heard for every day in the news there would be stories about how there's a need for an investigation. And the lack of political mobilization for that investigation tells us that it was, in fact, the U.S. government that was the likely perpetrator. But as we've seen, it looks like the U.S. is going to get away with it, and the European countries are not prepared to actually stand up to Washington to demand answers and hold the U.S. government accountable for this act of economic sabotage.
We know that there was in total 4 explosions, each around 500 kilos TNT. And that, of course, creates an immediate shock wave that, as any explosion does, can cause harm to living organisms. So fish and mammals that are within around 4 kilometers radius from these explosions will be killed. If they are further away, up to 40 or 50 kilometers away, the mammals will experience hearing loss. Chemical munition dump sites. So after World War II, around 30,000 tons of chemical warfare agents was dumped. And it's important, coming from an environmental point of view, also to be aware that armed conflicts have consequences also for the environment and natural organisms out there. And it's important to think about them as well. Not in the first place, because of course this is mostly a humanitarian disaster and problem. It's also an infrastructure and economic problem, but it is actually also an environmental problem.
Они не подключают нас к расследованию.
They do not connect us to the investigation. They even made attempts to blame us. They will come up with any excuses. They even thought of it to the point that it is impossible to comment on anything until the end of the investigation. And this despite the fact that all through life, the latest history, they ran first to the microphone, first in order to not only comment, but also to accuse and pass judgments in connection with what they themselves did in many provocative ways. The same Salisbury, Amesbury, all types of poisoning allegedly with no voik, and so on. Now they have no right to anything and come up with more and more excuses not to be interested in the fate of their country, its economy, finances and energy security. And all these things are interconnected today.
Ее экономики, финансов, энергетической безопасности, а это все вещи взаимосвязаны на сегодняшний день.